Good afternoon, everyone. I am with the privilege of introducing myself, and I was suggested to take a moment to introduce a little bit of background, and maybe that'll bring in some stragglers and provide a little bit of who is this guy and why am I here? Coming from the midstream oil and gas and chemical manufacturing side, so that's where I grew up. My name is Peter Weaver. I'm with a small startup SpaceTech firm called Orbital Advisors. We're a veteran-owned business. We're actually with our headquarters just outside of Denver and Golden, right next door to Colorado School of Mines. So there's that. I had a couple decades midstream operations, chemical manufacturing, a little time in the merchant marine. And following that, I had a nice opportunity to get off the coast and go up to Washington, D.C. as an advocate for the industry and do some policy work. So I spent about a decade in D.C. in front of the three-letter agencies and Congress talking policy and, more than that, education of how things really work in the real world. And that was my biggest takeaway from the Beltway is very, very few people who are in the role as lobbyists in Washington really know the industries they speak to. They know their way around the hallways. And so I found that a very interesting place to really understand the energy side. And that's where I met the two founders of my prior employer who had this idea of taking a very high technology, small sat, exploiting the small sat revolution, and using it as a commercial product for oil and gas. And I was able to kind of consult with them for a while. We did some trials, and son of a gun, we found some underground methane emissions using this sensor tech on aerial platforms. And I joined a startup, had to tell my wife, honey, I joined a startup and we don't have money for salaries, but I don't want to wonder what ifs. So that was back in 2016. And as things evolved, just earlier this year, I stepped away from that group with two of my other colleagues from that company and we started a new firm where we're using imagery from not just our own custom bespoke satellite constellation, but we're really trying to pull more broadly from the network of satellites that are out and about in terms of what are the right data sources for the solution that we're trying to deliver to this particular customer. Now, as it relates to mining, I reached out to Tim a little over a year ago with this idea, recognizing his focus on what's happening in mining finance. The more people in mining I spoke to, trying to discern what is a real pain point where satellites can actually deliver some type of value. You know, exploration obviously came up frequently, but also tailing ponds. Then we got into other issues, and the idea that ultimately mines are not necessarily looked upon favorably by all the communities where they're operating. Social license to operate is actually a thing, and capital doesn't like uncertainty. Is there a correlation between Tim's interest and how finance works within the mining sector, and the possibility that some imagery could help contribute to concerns from the community, undergirding trust issues that maybe a little enhanced transparency could help alleviate some of the uncertainty and pain from social license to operate. So that's kind of the theme. I think I've burned enough time that we've got enough stragglers. And over the next 15 minutes or so, what I'll talk about is, the theme for this overarching afternoon session, kind of what's changed. And yes, there's an elephant in the room. I'll address that just as a kind of a primer getting started before sharing my sense of what's happening in space tech and why. Why is it interesting and why is it relevant? I'll point to a number of the satellites that are in operation, the constellation's capabilities, and then ultimately, the punchline for you here, I think, would be, well, so what? Why would I care? And is there a utility for this type of information for your operations, your clients, your members, whatnot? And then coming full circle to a topic and a theme that Adam Hawkins had this morning on the Capturing Hearts and Minds, which is how do we shape the narrative and take advantage of this really intriguing moment in time where policy is shifting very fast and actually in a favorable way. So what has not changed? Well, one thing that has changed is I've lost a couple of graphics since moving to this Apple platform. What's not changed is, right, public perceptions. Most people in the public who don't really know the industry, they'll see a story where somewhere else in the world there was a catastrophe. And that shapes the general sense. And I don't see that necessarily changing. The other thing that really hasn't changed is the social license to operate. I think it's as important now as ever. And regardless of what happens from a policy standpoint, I don't see that changing at all. I think the importance of trust and transparency and a community embrace of anyone who's operating in their region is going to be more important than ever. So what has changed? Before this session last year, I encountered this pull quote on the top. I will read it. Mining investment risk hit a 7-year high globally last year, this was November of last year, with mining companies and investors affected by rising legal and regulatory headwinds. It was political obstructionism, I don't know if that's too strong a word, to the sector, right? An antagonism towards energy production, or environmental bases, or whatever it was. Well, where we are today, the elephant in the room is very different. We had a massive election swing, and what we know is the incoming administration is very pro-energy. The way I describe it is America first, energy security, and responsible production. So all those pieces hopefully will tie together in a way that in the near term, and by near term I mean 3 to 6 months, for influencing policymakers with the right messages so they can make good decisions that can begin to be implemented over the next 2 years before we get to the next congressional cycle. The window to really start moving the needle, I think, is short, and it's a unique moment in time to actually move that needle. And I think to your point earlier, there's Rick, moving the needle for this administration is one thing, but hopefully there will be some movement that actually can carry forward through a legislative activity that'll have a little bit more sustainable benefit for this industry. One image that it did pop up. I'm sure, right, this came up earlier, China's announcement yesterday. Talk about an influence on the policymakers in terms of what are today's priorities. This has got to have everybody's attention. So over the last 4 years, our sector hasn't really been in the central limelight of what's been happening in Washington policy. It's been kind of dereliction by neglect rather than the affirmative opposition that we saw during the Obama years. So anyway, that's kind of policy background and what's happening in SpaceTech. I really like this chart on the left. And in fact, the original source is an animation. And if you want to jot it down, because any of this gets you a little excited, leolabs.space/visualizations, you can look it up. And you can see in real time all of the satellites, it's about 13,000 of them today, orbiting the surface of the Earth. And you can actually hover over any one of them and see what its name is, who owns it, what its elevation is. There's a lot of information. It's pretty fascinating. Just a few years ago, right, kind of around the beginning of COVID, the number of satellites, active satellites in orbit was half what it is today. You go back to 2016, when I kind of migrated from actual energy to this virtual concept of creating space-based solutions, it was half that still, about 3,000. And what's going to happen next is, it's almost like Moore's Law with computing power. There's going to continue to be very rapid advances, and a lot of that's driven by Elon Musk, SpaceX, Transporter, Rideshare, and Starship about to come up. Now, most satellites in orbit today are used for comms, just communication, things like that. Starlink's a perfect example. But next up on the list is going to be Earth observation, so GIS types of things. And there are commercial operators crossing the spectrum of imagery technology for various business models, different resolutions, different target customers, whether it's private people or mostly government, different price points. This shows 70 current individual commercial space operators, each one that owns and operates their own satellites or constellations. Now, of the solutions that these satellites are addressing, I would postulate that methane is probably the one that's in the news the most. Everyone's aware of satellites finding methane plumes. And this one chart on the far left, it was from a European Geospatial Union paper in 2022. It shows all the satellites that are operating or were planned for methane. You've got government satellites like Sentinel and Prisma, NMAP, EMIT. And then you've got the Environmental Defense Fund runs methane sat, and Planet's got Carbon Mapper, GHG sat, and there are a number of other ones. I mentioned how this is happening. This image on the left is one of my favorites, especially it's kind of like a glamour shot for what's happening in SpaceTech. That is the nose cone of the Transporter 10 mission, SpaceX rideshare. This was March of this past year. 53 payloads, 53 satellites in there. One of them was methane sat. Two of them, the ghosts up there, I actually have a financial interest in, and I don't know that I'm ever going to get anything out of it, but it did mean I got to go to the launch, which was super cool. Have any of you been to a launch? Any of you watching what's happening with Starship? The largest rocket ever? There are 50 Starship launches planned for 2025. That's like one a week out of Brownsville, Texas. I'm probably going to go down there to watch one just as I'm interested. It's incredible, right? When you think about it, the largest rocket ever, bigger than Apollo, it's going to go up 50 times next year. Nobody even knows about it. It's amazing. So that's why this idea of what's happening in SpaceTech has some relevance in terms of, if nothing else, just pondering the possibilities. Because like a smartphone in your pocket, right? A StarTech was a long time ago. Where we are today, massive chasm. Yes, Tim.
I mean, I will add, just 3 weeks ago, I was at Cape Canaveral, Florida.
Yeah.
And within that week, SpaceX launched 3 times.
Yeah.
And I saw, within the span of 10 days, 2 launches.
What's happening at Cape Canaveral is incredible.
Yeah.
You go back 15 years, it was a ghost town.
Yeah.
And now it's just boom, they're building a monorail to it and everything else.
And I can attest to that because in private, anecdotal conversations with locals, that's exactly what they said. They said, this is the best thing that's happened to us. And a little factoid that I didn't realize, pardon me for interrupting.
Yeah, that's right.
But I sort of got a little bit bent out of shape about Mr. Bezos. But at the age of 13 or 16, he stood in front of an audience and said, I'm going to build a company that's going to finance me to build his whole space enterprise that he's now
Interesting.
Yeah, so he, at the age of 16, Jeff Bezos, the CEO, founder of Amazon, had that vision at that young age to want to build an enterprise to finance and fund all of that, what he's doing. Which one is his? Blue Star?
Blue Star.
Yeah.
Blue Origin.
Blue Origin, yeah.
Sorry. I will say, Tim earns a prize. I'm not proud in that I give away incentives for customer participation. As a better-known company, it's an American flag lapel pin. Everybody should have one, so Okay, back to the agenda. What's possible today? In the mining sector, again, I've thought about this in 2 ways. There's the social license to operate, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The idea, I believe, is social license has been eroded because of news that's been very negative, catastrophic, fatalities, environmental detriment, what have you. Regardless of how widespread or having anything to do with your operation or even the United States, it's shaped perception. Lack of trust. Best way to resolve trust, I think part of the mix, and I know it's complex, is with transparency. What could be a better way to engage on the idea of transparency than, here's our plan, we'll show you what's happening, we'll give you periodic updates of imagery over our site, and we can talk about it. And use different analytical tools to build out, not just pictures, but pictures with analytics. That's great stuff. But there's still operational benefit, exploration benefit. I think in the designing phase, having due diligence is tremendously important, and the idea of baselining and using satellite imagery as baseline for historical contamination and other moisture content, water features, etc. Construction and development, extraction and operations that can be operationally beneficial, pollution tracking, soil contaminants and whatnot. Also the social license trust, and then finally getting to closure and reclamation, which, right, at the end of the day, I think many communities have sincerely been burned by bad operators walking out prematurely and leaving them with a mess behind. And again, regardless if it has anything to do with you, that's a taint. And I think satellites can help alleviate that. Now, this is the same imagery from the last frame on the left, and the one on the right is the same imagery also with an analytical tool applied to it. For reference, this is weekly images taken between this past May and last week. So, one thing to take away, the ability to get this imagery and turn it around quickly. I could have gotten 2 more frames since then, but then I had to go to PowerPoint. No way. The frame on the left, it's an NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. Basically, greenness. Is the vegetation healthy? What I like about the NDVI image is you've got the mining site there, kind of on the center, kind of top left. What's to the far east of the mining site? It's a golf course, right? And south of the mining site, kind of like a veteran community. So depending on what the analytic you're interested in, it could be moisture content, it could be vegetative health, it could be different type of pollution features. The ability to have that kind of information feeding into your operation, validating what you already know that we have integrity and we're keeping our systems contained, but also to be able to have that conversation with the community. Or when certain features pop out, some of these red, cycles through, right? It's an opportunity to engage your community and talk about what's happening and why. It just expands the capability to have a basis for a discussion on transparency. We're doing a lot of this in oil and gas already, as I kind of alluded to, and this is a similar type of example. You can see some roadways pop up, and the concern in oil and gas is there an encroachment that could threaten my asset? There's also, are there new buildings being constructed which give me a regulatory burden of a higher integrity standard for managing my pipeline asset? So we're already beginning to do this type of work, not just for individual sites, but thousands of miles of pipeline. And of course, finding methane is part of that too. We can talk about that offline if anybody cares at all. This is an example I pulled together for someone who we're speaking to about monitoring all the pipelines in Mexico. That's a lot of miles. And it points to the beauty of how the satellite platform, I mean, if you just have one site, yes, you could use a drone or an airplane and it's fine. But when you start talking about multiple sites, multi-state, broad distribution, you can't beat the logistics of on orbit. You just can't. And we're using multiple satellites to feed our analytics at Orbital Advisors. There are 2 satellite constellations that we pointed to for this particular project. One is the red stripes, where this is 5 days worth of coverage. We're capturing the entire network of Mexico in 5 days. And then the white ones kind of go in catty corner to it. It's a different constellation, less frequency, higher granularity. What's your problem? We can employ the right data sources to help work through that. Price points come into play and all that. But as a general rule, we're really wanting to operate within existing budgets rather than coming up with new budgetary line items. I did a search on critical mineral strategy, wondering what's been the conversation in this country over the last couple of years. I used DuckDuckGo, not Google. The first one on the list was federal strategy to ensure secure and reliable supplies. 2020. The next 8 or 10 lines in the search, not one was the United States. They're all from Australia. Interesting. Again, almost a dereliction by neglect. Given the announcement from China yesterday, I don't think that's going to be part of it. There was a clear understanding that energy security is vital, and mining's a big part of that. So again, coming back to the type of slides that I'm sure you've seen this model, social license to operate. Every one of these I've seen, trust keeps coming up. As I think about how do you deal with that, transparency, to me, is one important part of the conversation. I'm hypothesizing that there's utility for operators, for mining programs to think about how to incorporate these platforms now to engage their community, as well as get some operational benefit out of it while you're at it. And appreciate Tim's providing me an opportunity to join you. I really do think our industry has a great story to tell. I think the policy platforms that are coming, like getting the bully pulpit back, frankly, I think that helps a lot. I think communities respond to what the policymakers are pushing in their region. And the truth that there was a speaker this morning, Julian Adams, conversation that, right, the hippie mining chick, and it's how she described herself. She said, I love the earth, but I also love all the things we get from the earth. The ability to fly here and arrive in Reno from New Orleans, right? Get here in a couple of hours, pretty cheap, comfortable hotel room. We can't have our standard of living without the products that come. And frankly, if they're not produced in the first world, they're going to be produced somewhere else with a lot less concern about environmental considerations. And I think that's part of the conversation too. There's a lot of value to be doing more domestically and friendshoring and whatnot. So I welcome your questions and commentary. Hopefully that was
Thank you, Peter.
worth your time.
Does anybody want to ask him a question? Go ahead.
Yes, what do you think about which new sort of sensors are going to go up these highlights next? What's the next thing joining there?
So hyperspectral's been this promise for a couple of decades, and that's what I've been playing with for the last 6 years. What I found there is, like a lot of things, like a hybrid mountain bike, you're making trade-offs. It's not really great road bike, it's not really great mountain bike either. With hyperspectral, what I found where I've been working is to get the full series of bands, we had to trade off with swath width. We weren't getting the frequency we wanted. I think seeing more computing power to deal with the larger data sets that come up with these more powerful sensors would be how I describe it. Still going to be kind of ultraviolet through infrared more than anything. And LiDAR is interesting, right? Does it become less costly when you have more persistence? Driving costs down is key. And the other piece that's going to be really interesting is, do the operators of these constellations learn how to speak to folks sitting in the chairs where you are? Because that's been my one big takeaway, not unlike my time in DC. You got people going there, you got people in SpaceTech who really are excited about their technology. They really love their technology, but it doesn't mean they know. Like, look what I've got, you should buy it. You're not solving my problems. So those are kind of my two things, is faster computation power, driving costs down, and a little bit better ability to interface with the market. That was a long-winded answer.
And you get a prize.
Okay, yes, sir.
All these things that you're seeing out there, putting up there, are they all subscription items? Or are they, hey, access to government websites and download it?
Yes. So I believe the correct answer to every question is it depends. It depends on which satellite you're talking about. There are a number of them that are government owned and operated, whether it's USG or European Space Agency, where you can go in and pull data yourself. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's not as easy as just going to Google Maps and getting a picture, right? You have to have a little bit of GIS familiarity to do that. There are others where I used to work, for instance, where the idea was we'll sell you a subscription, we'll give you a solution on a periodic basis. And then there are others that are quite expensive. And then there are a number of those operators who are really only looking to sell USG. So it does depend, but there's a whole portfolio, and I think the proliferation of new launches will lead to inevitably more access to reasonable commercial solutions. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, like Google Earth, even Esri is now being able to allow you to go back 10 years.
Yeah.
So if you're doing stuff every 5 days, what's the retention, like data that's being generated?
So right now,
It's about data.
right now, generally speaking, the data sources we're pulling from, once it's captured, it's accessible historically. And we have some sources that we can go back 5, 6, 7 years. We have some that it's not so much. But so far, we're not seeing a lot of that going away. You know, interesting. You know what the one area that Amazon is profitable right now? One. You know where Amazon makes all its money? All of it?
The cloud.
AWS. That's it. They lose money on the store, all that stuff. So interestingly, those business models, Microsoft is really clamoring to get it. So data power gets cheaper, and as large as these data sets really are, I mean, they're absurdly massive. Those platforms are so far giving us pretty good lookbacks. If you know how to get there, if you know how to do it. And frankly, that's one of the things that my organization is really focused on is simplifying that process, because it does take effort to do it. And we think doing it at scale is helpful. Yes, ma'am.
What is AWS?
Sorry, Amazon Web Services. So cloud storage.
Okay.
If you have petabytes of data and you just don't want it on your platform, you can pay them and they'll store it. Yes, sir.
For your actual company, there's a lot of very useful things that can really think of doing with them, but I'm guessing that you have a pretty hard time convincing mining companies of that. How does your sales pitch work, and are you able to actually show people that there is value here?
Here I am. That's a great question. I will try to respond quickly as I had done in the oil and gas side and how I'm hoping to migrate on the mining side. On the oil and gas side, it's a long sales cycle. So that's part of it. This is not selling a cell phone or whatever, cable TV. So understanding the pain point, what's the problem we're trying to solve, is a very important opener for a conversation. Having a conversation then would lead to, what can you do about it? Well, I can show you some vaporware of what I propose to do about it. Well, on the mining side, today is literally the first time I'm able to stand in front of a group like this and say, we're actually doing it. We're doing it, and this is an example. For example, can we use that as a hypothetical starting point for maybe it's not NDVI that you want as imagery, it's something else. And again, on the mining side, we're really focused on like moisture content is one we hear a lot about, produced water, things like that. So maybe that's a solution. How do we advance the conversation? So yes, it's going to be a little bit of a long cycle, but there's a capability available today. Hopefully there's enough interest that will resonate that we can talk about some real tests. Even just, let's just do this weekly visit for your project for next year and let's see what we see. Because that is part of it, right? The golf course looks great. What if you started seeing some less green encroaching in on one of their greens? Could that be coming from your site? Well, I don't know, but it allows us to make better decisions and deploy limited resources in a way that's at least targeted. Because that's really my big focus is better decision making, more targeted deployment of limited resources.
Thanks, Peter.